Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to let you know about a few upcoming events we have. One of them is going to be Brian Evanson in conversation with Matt Bell about Evanson's new story collection, The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell. That's next Tuesday, August 3rd. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Karolina Waclawiak and Vanessa Veselka. Karolina Waclawiak is the author of the novels How to Get into the Twin Palms and The Invaders. Formerly an editor at The Believer, she is the executive editor of culture at BuzzFeed News. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the Virginia Quarterly's Review, Hazlitt, and elsewhere. Waclawiak's breakout novel, Life Events, follows Evelyn, who at 37 is on the verge of a divorce and anxiously dreading the death of everyone she loves. She combats her existential crisis by avoiding her husband and aimlessly driving along the freeways of California looking for an escape, one that eventually comes when she discovers a collective of exit guides. Evelyn enrolls in their training course where she learns to provide companionship and a final exit for terminally ill patients seeking a conscious departure. She meets Daphne, a dying woman still full of life, Lawrence, an aging porn king, and Daniel, who seems too young to die and whom Evelyn falls for despite knowing better. Each client opens something new in Evelyn, allowing her a chance to access her own grief and confronts the self-destructive ways she suppresses her pain. When Evelyn travels through the Southwest to an afterlife convention to further her death education, she must finally face her complicated relationship with her alcoholic father and reconcile her life choices. Sensitively observed and darkly funny, Life Events is a moving, enlivening story of the human condition, the doldrums of loneliness, the consuming regret of past mistakes, and the thrill, finally, of finding meaning and love where you least expect it. Joining Waclawiak in conversation this evening is Vanessa Veselka. Veselka is the author of the novel Zazen, which won the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize and the Great Offshore Grounds, longlisted for the National Book Award. Her short stories have appeared in Tin House and ZYZZYVA, and her nonfiction is in GQ, The Atlantic, Smithsonian, The Atavist, and was included in the Best American Essays and the anthology Bitch Fest, 10 Years of Cultural Criticism. So this evening's event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well as if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please consider supporting Karolina and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her new novel from us. A link to buy Life Events along with Vanessa's books will be shared in the chat a couple of times tonight. So Karolina, Vanessa, it's such a delight to have you here tonight, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us. I am very impressed by your pronunciation of our last names. So I'm going to read from the novel. The paperback is out as of yesterday, and then Vanessa and I will launch into a chat. So you have context for what the book is about. This particular section is Evelyn's first training as an exit guide. So it's pretty early on in the book, and I will get started. Bethany said she was deeply committed to helping people die consciously and to creating an army of empaths who could be sent out into the world to spread the word of death acceptance. We were doers. We were performing a service, and she had chosen us through our carefully filled out applications. She said she could tell that there were some applicants who were not in it for the right reasons, and so they didn't make the cut. We were handpicked to perform this service for others. She wanted us to know we were special. But before we were sent out to the field as exit guides, there were a number of self assessments we had to get through. The first was an exercise that we used to prepare ourselves for death, which Bethany said required the kind of relationship to truth and honesty that most people do not have. We paired up, seats facing each other, and held hands. Nathan was sitting 2 seats away from me and introduced himself as he swiveled his seat around and faced his palm out toward me. How are you? He asked. The truth was, and always is, that I didn't know. But I mouthed fine with a smile so we could move on. Bethany wanted Nathan in here as a support for the new trainees. He told me he had already been out in the field and said it was heavy but meaningful work. Nathan had crow's feet around his blue eyes, and he looked of indeterminate age, maybe 35, more likely a healthy Los Angeles 45. He wore New Balance sneakers, a dark blue t-shirt, and unfashionable jeans that he probably thought were fashionable. He was a person you would pass on the street and maybe casually stare at for too long, but not in a way that made you feel hungry for someone. He was the kind of person you could project whatever you wanted onto. Bethany called out, "Look down at your sheets of paper. You'll ask the question to your partner over the course of 5 minutes, then you'll switch." I looked down at the sheet of paper and there was only one question on it. How do you avoid pain? We were about to launch into what Bethany called pain avoidance techniques with each other, and all I wanted to do was escape. Nathan seemed to be a joiner, whereas I was not. I had watched as he walked up to people at the beginning of the session and introduced himself to strangers like they were friends he couldn't wait to have. He seemed to be able to produce a casual intimacy with anyone. I wanted that sort of ease too, but instead I was the kind of person who avoided eye contact. Do you want to ask first or should I? He said. Evelyn, right? In the sea of names, he remembered mine, and the gesture felt meaningful to me. You, I said, and instantly regretted it. He smiled and said, How do you avoid pain, Evelyn? Xanax, sometimes Klonopin instead. He was unfazed. I was starting off easy. How do you avoid pain, Evelyn? Wine. How do you avoid pain? My weed pen. How do you avoid pain? Obviously, however I can. I'd run out of the kind of answers that felt safe to disclose, so I was moving on to jokes. He asked me again, and I said, making jokes. People were echoing the question all around us, but I couldn't make out their murmured answers. The question itself had taken on the quality of an incantation vibrating through the room, and I suspected it was supposed to lead us to transcendence, but I wasn't feeling it. Nathan settled into his seat and asked me again. We had 4.5 minutes to go. Sex, I said. It was mostly a lie now. I wanted to see a reaction, but again I got none. Why did I want to get a rise out of him? I wasn't prone to acting out anymore. How do you avoid pain? I don't know. How do you avoid pain, Evelyn? I didn't feel pain anymore. I avoid people, I said. How do you avoid pain? I avoid relationships. Relationships are for other people, I said, smiling. It didn't feel true, but I wanted it to be. How do you avoid pain? I shut down. I was shutting down. The question was floating all around me, and I was starting to feel lightheaded, as if I was on the verge of an anxiety attack. My face felt hot, and I wondered if he could tell that I was melting down, or if I was hiding my spiral well enough to go unnoticed. He stared at me. Had I broken something in him? I hoped so. Evelyn, how do you avoid pain? I searched the walls for a clock, but found none. 5 minutes felt like an eternity when you were in an endless loop of defending yourself. I looked around and saw people crying. They were transcending their own humanity or something, having breakthroughs. But I had given Nathan a bum deal. He would not break me. I don't feel pain. What? All I feel is pain. Time, Bethany shouted as a headache began to sprout behind my eyes. Nathan said, Great answers. Loved them. So good. He could not stop smiling at me and patted my knee and even reached to squeeze my hand. I did not stop him. The palm of his hand felt rough against my skin, and I imagined what he did with his hands to make them feel so rough. As he looked at me, proud that we had shared a moment, I could feel that I had sweated through the back of my shirt. I looked at the people comforting their partners and could tell everyone around me had reached a new level of understanding. but I didn't feel closer to Nathan. I gave him a weak smile back, feeling like a fraud who couldn't transcend anything. Switch, Bethany said. I stared at Nathan and I could tell he was excited for this. How do you avoid pain, Nathan? I run, he said. How do you avoid pain? I really listen to what a person is saying when I'm with them, really give them the space for their feelings. You know what I mean? I nodded and said, uh-huh. Thanks.
Okay, I was coming off mute. That section, I love that section. I got lucky to read parts of this along the way, not a lot, but like right towards the end. And then, I just, congratulations on such a powerful book. It's not your first book. You know that I've really enjoyed your work over the years. And there are certain themes that run through it. And so there's a lot of them I want to ask you about. And I also want to thank you on behalf of anybody who's ever been in a situation where controlled performative catharsis was the expectation of the room. It is a terribly uncomfortable place to be in for those of us who, frankly, may not be how we we do what we do. So I've always really enjoyed your characters because your characters have, vulnerabilities in strange places, and I really love that about them. And
I never thought about it that way, but thank you.
Yes, and that there's not a pathologizing of it. So I think there is an interesting, even in this scene, there's a very interesting thing where, on the one hand, Evelyn is highly aware of the places where she is not open to experiences that would be very vulnerable, and on the other hand, so there's the self-narration. I mean, obviously it's a first-person but there's the narration of it too, and so there's a lot of things in it. But what I'd like to ask you about, and you and I've talked a little bit about these things in some ways before, but we both have a love of writing female drifters a bit, and also, where. So I want to ask you, with regards to Evelyn and with regards to even some of your other characters you've written about, drifting away from what? In some ways, because I think that there's a lot of assumptions about women of certain ages, women who had kids, who didn't have kids, who had, like there's all these sort of orientations in sort of literary topography that we have inherited about what it means to be drifting from something. A lot of times it's like, well, they're not in a functional relationship. Like, what does drifting mean? So before we have that, what does drifting mean to Evelyn and to you as you think of those characters?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think for Evelyn, she is super self-aware, but that's almost more frustrating because she sees what her limitations are. She knows like she's not this person who's going to have this grand catharsis. She's missing the mark in so many ways, but she sees exactly, like, for lack of a better way of saying it, what's wrong with her that's making her like not know how to essentially be a person in her mind. And so, yeah, I do love writing about female drifters and female misfits. And I think in each one of my books, each woman sort of doesn't know how to be a traditional woman or play the role of like the way they're supposed to be at whatever age they are. And I think it's frustrating to all of them. It's certainly frustrating to Evelyn. There's a section of the book where she's like, she doesn't understand why she can't be a wife, but she hates being a wife. And like everyone around, like in traditionally, like everyone's around being a wife. Like, what is wrong? She's thinking like, what is wrong with me that I feel allergic to this? And so it's almost like she's allergic to the traditional modes of being a woman. And she's also really ambivalent about having a child, and that is a problem in her marriage. And so what she's drifting away from, I think, is is like all the prescriptions of what you're supposed to do at 37, you know, all those big life events you're supposed to achieve, a house, a husband, a child, and like that life that in many ways feels very performative to her. And so it's just one more thing that she's bucking against, but that isn't to say she has a complicated relationship to why she keeps bucking against these norms. And I think, you know, she drifts into this group of exit guides who really are like this hodgepodge group of people, but they're all like very normal in specific ways. And even there, she feels like an outsider. I think I really love writing people who feel alienated and teasing out like what it means to be a woman who's alienated in her spaces.
You know, when you talk about alienation, I remember that just walking in, you brought back this image of, remember walking into a classroom when I was an older student and, you know, not matching with anybody else who was in the room and feeling very out of place until somebody wrote Verfremdenheit, you know, alienation on the board in German. He's like, welcome to German class. I was like, okay, great. And I remember the reason I mentioned that is that there are schools of, there are literary moments that are very focused on alienation. And, you know, it particularly shows up in different forms of, you know, countries' literature and things like that as a theme. And I think American alienation is a very interesting kind because it's an isolation, it's a subcultural isolation a lot of times, where you drop from one culture into another subculture. And so I'm always very interested in narrative. And when you're talking about the things, the events she's drifting away from, you know, it's hard to tell sometimes whether are they the actual events or is it the narrative of events? Because, you know, I think that there is also this thing where people, where I guess, when I look at American isolation, you know, isolation and American alienation, in some ways, it's the ability to take things that are, you know, sound like off-grid, you know, kind of edgy kinds of things, and actually turn them into meaningless objects that recreate that have the narrative intact, but are equally without actual human engagement in in a real way, by not having any skin in the game, by not having, you know. So I'm curious about.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this novel takes place in the desert, right? Which is like the traditional narrative of isolation and wandering. And, you know, people go out west to find themselves all the time. And I think you and I have certainly talked about how those narratives have traditionally been, you know, a man goes out west to find himself, you know, this sort of like manifest destiny, retaking the land, finding my own space kind of thing. And I find it interesting to, you know, look at how a woman inhabits those spaces. And, you know, there's a section of the book later on where Evelyn is in Death Valley. And I think you and I have certainly talked about this in that sort of it, the wandering has a specific kind of fear for women, and that isolation is loaded for women, right? There's a sense of freedom in it, but there's also fear associated with being alone out west, you know, in a place where you don't know if there's threats, because we've been raised to be vigilant about threats as women. So I wanted to play with that narrative as well, and really see like, if what Evelyn wants is freedom, right? She spends a lot of time driving around. She spends a lot of time driving on the outskirts of Los Angeles and in the deserts there. Like, what does it look like for her to feel free? And like, it's not the same thing as it would be for a man who like takes off on his own, because there's just different threats. And even like, there's a portion in that same section where she's talking about what it means to strike out on your own as a woman later in life versus a man. And I think it's really interesting culturally to be asking those questions, and like thinking about what narratives we've grown up with in movies and in film and in books, and thinking about how we can subvert those narratives.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, so this gets into some of the sort of idea of what a midlife crisis looks like for women. And I think that the midlife crisis, you know, I think it's a mistake to parallel it at all to the male traditional midlife crisis. And I think that, you know, if I were to sort of like, you know, take a reductionist approach, that is something where the role of provider, the role of XYZ is being sort of challenged with, I could have been potentials, other potentials. Any crisis is always about other potentials. So in that sense, there's a similarity. What are the other potentials? You know, annihilation is another potential. And there is this quality in Evelyn that is interested in potentials of annihilation. And I think that like the fact that, you know, women's sort of midlife, whatever is, you know, gets like grotesquely put into like empty, like, I mean, it gives no space. It's sort of like you know, we think of it as an infertility or fertility crisis one way or another.
Right.
Because of the biological impaired, you know, I mean, that kind of thing. But, you know, if you are looking at potentials and you are looking for the potential for annihilation, social annihilation, personal annihilation, relationship annihilation, how does Evelyn fit into that? And how do you see her midlife crisis?
I mean, I think that she's like, we meet her when she is annihilating her life, like everything, all the things that she has set up for herself that she now feels like this is wrong, this doesn't feel good, I'm not on the right path. I mean, she's blowing it all up. And I think it's attractive. A part of the narrative of like women's midlife crisis is like setting fire to your life and walking out of it, right? It's not like I'm going to buy myself a car. Yeah, I'm not going to have, you know, an affair and get a car and like, you know, hope my wife doesn't find out. It's like I am blowing up my life. It is scorched earth and I am out of here. And I think that's really interesting, but you know, it's almost like too easy for her to just self-immolate here in this book. You know, in her awareness, she knows that doesn't work. And as in the scene that I read, she's going through all the ways she's been slowly annihilating herself over a period of time. And it's like, you're numb until you're not. And you have to keep, you know, upping the milligrams on your Xanax for it to work. And at a certain point, you have to face your life and say, you know, I have all these regrets, right? I've taken on a life path. I'm at 37. I'm looking back. I'm thinking like, what have I done? I feel like she came from a place where she didn't realize she had choices. And in, you know, at this crucial moment where she's meeting these exit guides and she's meeting Bethany, who is like the head of this organization, and she's starting to help people die, it's only then that she starts realizing she has choices, because she is with people who are actively choosing to die and actively walking away from suffering. And I think that's like a huge revelation for someone who thinks revelations are bullshit, you know? And I think so. It's almost like she's come from a place of annihilating herself, and now she's trying to rebuild and actually have the kind of life she wants to, even if she doesn't really know what that is yet when we meet her.
Can I throw something else out? I was thinking about, you know, this question of euthanasia and this question of, you know, how do you exit and what kind of exit? And she is starting to see people who are all grappling with that. And also this idea that there is or could be a way to make those choices with a sort of, you know, and I don't, this is not the best word, harm reduction, but what I mean is like, there is a way to choose how to do it with the least amount of pain or the more amount of pain. There's a questionnaire that you talk about, right, with it, which is like, you know,
How much suffering, what's your suffering threshold? Like how much of your body function
have to be gone or have to be, you know, for you to want to take this path out. And that like finding your space on that. By the way, I did that with my mom, who was she was about to go through a surgery. She's fine. And she was just like, I said, so what are these levels, before we don't, do X? And she was just like, anything that's worse than anything I can't, if I can't do everything like I did it today, take me out. I'm like, that is a really high bar, And so that question, I say that because like that question of like how,
How
that,
much suffering are you willing to live with, basically?
and that's a real freedom of choice to say like, what does it mean to say like, okay, my like desire to get out with a certain amount of suffering is in a very different place.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to ask about is, so that's already to me like it's all choices, right? Evelyn's looking at something that is all choices, that's minute choice, that's specific, that's like really looking within. And I could not help, and maybe I'm off track with how you were sort of, I cannot help but when we're thinking about talking about death and the way it's talked about in this novel, and the choices and the sort of choosing how you want to exit. And we talk about sometimes in culture, like everything's on fire. And it's like, how do you get people to walk out so that the most people live, or there's the least amount of pain and suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try to say this gracefully, but like with climate change and all these other things, I think everybody who is sentient, alive, and aware of what's going on today knows that there are certain choices we don't have
Yeah.
anymore. And that we have to choose, like this skill that like Evelyn is facing. How do we make choices? How do we live with knowing some annihilations are there?
Mm-hmm.
Some are imminent, some are going to happen, and others may not have to. And how much can I, you know what I mean? Like, how do we live? So I'm not trying to, her thing is very personal, but I think that the sort of connection and intimacy she's having with choice
Yeah.
becomes it is something that everybody needs to engage. And I don't mean something like whether you use a plastic cup. I mean, like, how do you inhabit your life fully, like you're here
Yeah.
in those, how,
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was talking to someone about, so much of this book is about pre-grieving,
right,
and the idea of pre-grieving is somewhat silly, right? In a way, Evelyn is trying to outsmart this grief that she knows is coming, and that's just not possible. And so much of it is about control. And I think a lot of this book is about letting go of control and realizing like the control that she thought she had, she didn't even have. And yet she was terrorizing herself about it. And these clients that she works with, in some ways, are still exerting, like this final act is a way of exerting control, saying like, I'm not actually going to wait until the natural end, because I know that road is just more suffering and I'm good now. But I think, we're in this, we're stuck in this pre-grieving stage right now with climate change. Like we know it's coming, and yet we don't, like the ship has sailed. And I think even the pandemic, we were either in grief or pre-grieving, expecting like loved ones to die and what have you. And so I think this moment right now is so painful for a lot of people if you are like a sentient being who thinks about these
I
things.
bar to include many things, yeah.
But like, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I think I've definitely talked to people now after going through the last 6 months where they are reimagining what their lives could be. And I think that part of it is saying, like, I do actually have choices, and maybe my ambition hasn't served me in the way I thought it would. Maybe this life path that I thought was so important and necessary is not actually. And so there is more space to feel like I do have choices, and it isn't the norm and the things that we've been told are important for us, whether it is relationships or jobs or career or whatever. And I think there's freedom in that, knowing like all these things that I thought were important are actually bullshit. And now I'm facing down like real, we don't know I mean, there's like a storm every day. There's droughts there. Like it's feeling very biblical, but I think we don't have to be in this like death grip of pre-grieving. You can actually do things
Right.
to try to live and
Right. And that's what
live differently.
and that's sort of where I see Evelyn's, even though her internal weather and her internal sort of sense of like what is to be feared and not feared, and how dangerous, she doesn't read danger. Like how does she read danger is all a part of that too, right? And so, I think that
Evelyn's a person who elects at, she's like, I'm out at 90%. Like
right. Well,
I
that's what, like I said, talking to my mom, and she was just like, I'm like literally going through the paperwork with her and, talking to her about it. And she's like, I don't want anything below what I could do today. I'm like, it's just, okay. So what do you say to that? And I think Evelyn is really, there is a tenderness, and I don't want to stop asking you questions and throwing things out here without talking about sexuality and promiscuity. Promiscuity, loaded term. I own it, meaning, like, I was, and women of our generation, I'm older than you, not by 20 years, but by 10, probably, I don't know. If you came up through a certain time owning that, like, that's an ugly ride. Like, you have to go through a lot of sort of like what the world is like in that, for all the different standards that are out there. Yeah. And the sexuality that Evelyn has, and the way that it engages with her grief, and the way that she experiments with what all of that means in her attempts to like touch and connect something. Can you talk about that in terms of like, does that fall into, so where does that sort of layer on top of like the classic male sort of promiscuity story?
Yeah.
Versus how is it, in this drifting or in this other sort of attempt for finding like actual touch, actual connection?
Yeah, I mean, I think Evelyn is a person who struggles with intimacy, and like being with someone as they're dying is a really intimate act, and it's very physical. She's in people's private spaces and she's watching their decay, and she's seeing people in really vulnerable positions. And I think that opens her up in a different way, but that doesn't mean that she knows how to be authentically intimate in other aspects of her life. I think she's really closed off because she is a person who wants to avoid pain. And so like true intimacy feels extremely loaded. And so I think, again, in this sort of the ways she used to numb herself, it was through sex, but that isn't to say she felt anything, right? It was the opposite. It was like another numbing agent. And so I think that, sex and death are extremely primal. And so of course they're forever intertwined. And when she's seeing people die, she can't help but like rush to be in physical situations. Though in the book, she doesn't really get into them because there's still something holding her back. But I think, it's like she wants to be seen, she wants to be understood, she wants to feel closeness to people, but that's something that she's drifting through and fumbling through to get, as well. And so it's hard, when she says, I don't have relationships are for other people, like she's not lying. I think that she doesn't know how to be with someone when there aren't, the parameters of this is just sex, or I like she needs to know how to orient herself as she's getting into every situation. And when she's there's one client in particular who is sexualizing her, and that feels comfortable. That feels like a cue to come in closer. And so she's trying to like figure all that out, but I think that's probably more common than we want to talk about.
Yeah. So I think I have one question, and then I think we should check and see about other Q&A and stuff.
Yeah, definitely throw your questions into the Q&A so we can answer them. Or I guess I will answer them.
I will not answer them. But right now I don't, yeah, so people can think about it and throw questions in. Otherwise, I'm going to keep asking you questions. Okay, so maybe this is just because I'm curious as a human about what you think about this. I kind of mentioned it earlier, but it just occurred to me, like, obviously this is only true to some extent, but I'm asking you to just tell me what you think. Is alienation, not isolating, but alienation, or perception of alienation, however you want to get into it, how much of that is just narration?
Like the stories we tell ourselves?
I mean, the constant, like, just narrating, like, I'm at a beach and it doesn't feel like being at a beach should feel. I'm around people and they're all having fun and I'm not having fun.
Right.
I can't feel the sun on my face. I'm sitting where the sun's on my face and this is happening and I can't feel it. Like that sort of like, how much is narration? And in that sense of it, how do you as a writer, if that is true, then you're dealing with layer upon layer of narration. But I'm just curious what you think, honestly.
I mean, it's interesting because from my personal experience, I feel like I've always felt alienated. And I think that's probably my background, like being born in Poland, coming to the US, like my parents, we were very Americanized, but it was still like offset from America with a capital A. And so I felt like I was always trying to find cues of
Mhm.
how to be, especially as a kid. And so I think that sort of reading the room and checking the exits, every place you go to make sure you know how to escape, you know how to be, you know how to orient yourself is like a very specific kind of vigilance. And I think that vigilance and that alienation really go hand in hand, because it's almost like people who feel alienated, especially my characters, are always trying to like read the room and orient themselves around other people to just not feel like they're standing out. And in many ways, they don't stand out at all. And so then they act out and then it's pulling back. And it's just this like weird dance of just trying to be a human person when you feel completely out of whack. But I think we probably all feel alienated in some ways because we are telling stories about ourselves. And like, I think this sense of like constant judgment about how I'm being and who I am and what's the perception of me. I'm not plagued by that, but I find those questions really interesting, especially when I'm writing characters who are acting out. You're sort of always like that vigilance goes into hyperdrive because you're like, am I too much? Do I pull back? Like how do I be a person essentially? But I think modern life is extremely alienating. And like, I think I can't even say coming out of the pandemic because we're still very much in it, but we being isolated in our homes and not even knowing how to like socially interact anymore, I think this feeling of alienation will probably be felt by many more people, than before.
Yeah. So we do have a question in the chat and I'm going to read it. As someone who's been in grief counseling, this is the questioner. I'm thinking another question that gets asked a lot, which is what's the worst that can happen? I thought about that when it came to the hummingbird and also the first scene of your Twin Palms book. Clearly a ringer. You know this person.
Who
They
is
know.
it?
I don't know. I'm not going to tell you.
No, I don't know this person, but thank you so much for asking, Kenny. Okay, go on.
I meant a ringer in the sense they know your work. I didn't
Oh
mean
yeah,
like it was
I
your brother.
didn't plant this.
I'm not thinking about the family member in there. Okay, especially the hummingbird and also the first scene in your Twin Palms book and how you masterfully face a taboo subject head on that way, which is a beautiful strategy for writing. How do you keep the faith? How do you keep the faith past that moment? In other words, what are your favorite writing tips?
Okay, so I would say I've gotten a lot of flack for writing unlikable female characters. And I, it used to really piss me off and now I don't care. And it's almost like a badge of honor in some ways. And I think knowing that for, to answer your question, I write in a way as if like no one's going to read it.
Mhm.
My first draft is always like, no one's ever going to see this. Do whatever you want, vomit on the page, be as like messy, have your characters be as messy and, balls to the wall as possible and pull back if necessary. But I think giving yourself a sense of freedom to let your characters act how they act without fear of judgment is extremely important. And I do write, I try to write books that have transgression in them. And not like cheap transgression, but really people who are just trying to live a different way or making choices that people won't agree with. And of course, that comes with like readers who get really upset or come to books with a lot of judgment. But I have so much love and compassion for my characters, and I think that's also like a writing tip, really loving your characters and having empathy for your characters even if you don't agree with everything that they do will really help you understand what motivates them and make the choices that you make as a writer have meaning rather than just putting your characters through hell. I hope that answered your question, Kenny. It was a great question.
I think the other thing that I'm frustrated by in the world, just because I'm going to throw it there, because it goes to what you were saying, is that I feel like while we're making a lot of headway about how we understand differences in all sorts of other ways and how to sort of like tread more mindfully in
Mm-hmm.
areas or learning curves or things like that, I think what's getting dragged along with that I don't like as much is that we're sort of coming to like, this is what a normal, healthy human looks like.
Yeah.
And that there is a kind of like, they talk this percentage of the time, they do this percentage of the time, they do that, you know what I mean? Like they all step back in the same way, they all step forward. And like we are starting to come into this like very prescriptive, and there's something more rabid and beautiful to me about people who don't fit into that world. And it's just like, yeah, so don't invite them to the party, like that level
Yeah.
of like vote with your feet, because
Yeah.
I really enjoy people who are, when we talk about misfits, I really enjoy people who really, some of my favorite people in the world are just kind of off balance.
Yeah.
They really are. And they're not going to be, I just don't want to have a personality that is like prescribed. Like this is what a good healthy human looks like.
Right.
It's like this is what a good healthy human performs like.
Right.
Right? Like that's a very different thing than an interiority or an ability to have intimacy. Because I know people who, for instance, all of their best friends are like, I so value people who are on the fringes of what is acceptable in terms of emotional personality and things like that, because they sometimes are the only person somebody else can understand. It's just, so yeah, I like your characters for that, but I also want to know how you see that or whether you agree with sort of how I'm.
Yeah, I do. I think at the core of all of these conversations that we're having, not only in this conversation, but like in general, it all comes back to forgiveness, right? And like who gets to judge others and like why we think we should be the arbiters of how people should act. Of course, there's terrible behavior that is not okay, but I think this sort of general policing does make nuance disappear. And I think, again, I really practice forgiveness in so many ways. People can do things that hurt me or I don't like, but like at the end of the day, you have to give them the dignity of their own experience. And I might not like what somebody's doing, you know, or the way they behave. I don't need to necessarily be around them all the time. But this sort of like need to sanitize everything does feel really harmful. It does feel really harmful.
So
Like we need the misfits.
we have another great question in here that just came up. Are you scared to die? And how would you describe your relationship with death?
Love the easy questions. Thank you, Laura.
This is exactly what should come out of a writer's conversation. Let's get to the point. Are you scared to die?
I'm going to ask you too in a second. So I'll answer and then you can answer.
You're the woman who asked.
Am I afraid to die? No, I'm not afraid to die at all. You know, I had like really bad anxiety in my early 20s, and it was all about having a fear of dying. Like there was a point at which I wouldn't even go to sleep because I thought I was going to die in my sleep, and so I wouldn't sleep for days. It was not cute. But I really, at a certain point, I let that fear go. And again, it's like such a control thing. And through writing this book, and I actually trained with a death doula. I took a course to really understand what that relationship to death looked like. I really don't fear death at all. You know, what I do fear is like everyone I love dying. And, you know, my mother died when I was finishing this book, but even then I was like, wow, the worst thing has already happened. I truly don't care anymore. Like I didn't think I would survive that, and I have, and I'm still here. And so I think, you know, my relationship to death is that I really want to live every day, you know, with this feeling of like no regrets, taking action. You know, I don't do that every day, but just, you know, trying to be a good person who's living a life that I can, you know, when I am ready to die, can look back and say, I did all the things and I'm okay. So that's my relationship to death. Are you afraid of dying?
Do you mean me, or are we asking the lovely woman in the chat?
I mean, I'm going to ask you, Vanessa.
Okay.
Laura, you can answer too in the chat if you'd like.
And I'll read it. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of missing people.
Yeah.
And I think that the times that I have, and I've been very close to death, and I've had my life threatened, and I experience terror. So I'm not saying I don't experience terror at the prospect of like imminent death. I do. I'm not afraid of dying. I am very unresolved and afraid of missing people, and also not wanting to make people miss me.
Yeah.
And so I think that's because I have a daughter too. It's a very different relationship with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that my fear of death, you know, I'll toss it back to you because I love it if we can end on this. Fear of death. Great. All for it. Fear of death, you know, it changes so much at different ages in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the silent dancing partner that you go through your life with, right, in some ways. And I think a lot of times you don't know it.
Yeah.
And the point in your life and your story in which you become aware that this is the silent dancing partner is a big turning point, right? And if it happens, and I'm just speaking from my experience, if it happens really young, a lot of times you have a really young response to it.
Yeah.
where it's just like, it can be overly tough, or it can be like invulnerable, or it can be, I'm afraid of nothing, or it can be, it can have all these other manifestations, as opposed to somebody who's sick and they're young for a period of time, and then they've really processed at that, I mean, so it changes and changes and changes. So I think it's fascinating where people encounter that. Like, I don't relate to people who say things like, well, I was immortal when I was 21. Like, that was not my experience of 21. Like, I don't remember ever thinking that I couldn't. And you came from different settings and things and probably had a sense of that.
Yeah.
Where do you think?
It's interesting because now that you're talking, I think I put myself in really harmful positions when I was a teenager where I absolutely could have died, but I was also in that moment when like the bad thing was happening. I very much was aware, like, shit, I might die.
Yeah, right, exactly. But
So
that's the thing, is you're choosing to dance with it, right? In a certain way.
yeah.
And
Then I felt like I escaped, right? And then it became like a don't ever do that again. And then I would do it again and be like, you cheated death again. What are you doing? I also, I had death in my life pretty early. So, but I didn't understand grief. And I think this book, I really had a deeper understanding of grief, which I don't think I had a relationship with, because there was a point in my life around 1920 when I was having like terrible panic attacks that two people who were really close to me died. And I didn't understand that I was grieving because nobody talks about grief.
how do you, okay, well, this probably won't be able to answer, but like, there is a difference between pain and grief. And I wonder if it's even possible to really grieve at a younger age.
I don't know. I mean, the death doula that I studied with said pain is a feeling, grief is an action. Like you're moving through grief.
Right.
There's so many different feelings associated with it. And, pain is something very specific. Grief, there's just so much involved with it. And it's also so specific to each person. We have obviously the stages of grief, but what that looks like for each person is so different, and how it comes in waves is so different. And I think it's just, I still find it mysterious, even though I have a relationship to it. So I don't understand, unless you're extremely self-aware and like just a brilliant kid, how you could ever have, like you said earlier, your relationship to death changes as you grow older. I think your relationship to grief also changes as you grow older.
So on death and grief, we should also mention, as we're going to tie this up now, that there are very funny parts to this book, and dark humor and other things runs throughout. And I think that those, the funniest people are the darkest people I know a lot of times.
How could you
And
not be Eastern European and dark as hell is always when people are like, wow, you're so blonde and smiley and yet your core is so dark. I'm like, I come from the Eastern Bloc. What do you want from me?
right, exactly. So I don't think we're coming up to time, and we don't have any more questions in the chat that I'm seeing, or I do see that the book links have been brought back in to remind people that we're talking about books, and Karolina and I have not just gone, into the, it's sort of the love and death Russian conversation. Oh, I see. Okay, so we have Sarah Boland. So this conversation is great. Love hearing you both talk about death. Best Wednesday night. Okay.
Thank you.
Right on, Sarah. So everybody should definitely buy Karolina's book, and
Everyone should also buy your books, and Zazen is coming out. It's being reissued. I love that book so much. I mean, there's so many books to be purchased in this evening on this call. So
with Zazen, I would say the new version, it comes out October 12th. So you want to wait probably.
Can you pre-order yet?
Cover and the all of that stuff. It's there'll be a thing, but you can't order it right now through Penguin yet. So
false alarm.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, that's cool. It's all good. Well, yeah, yes, thank you both so much for coming or talking tonight. It was a great chat. It was awesome. This is the book here. This is probably this is the right cover, right? Okay, yeah, that's good. That's good. So so please, yes, you got it. Oh, you got a different cover. Okay,
This
all
is
right.
the paperback. You have the hardcover.
Okay, all right.
Each
So
one is available.
yeah, they're both available, absolutely. So yes, please consider ordering a copy of this new book, and also check out Vanessa's works as well. And thank you everyone so much for just tuning in, and be sure to go into pals.com and check out our upcoming virtual events. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you at another one of these again. So thank you both so much.
Thanks
for
so much for
joining.
coming, and thanks for hosting us.
Of
Bye.
course. Bye. Have a good night, everyone. Bye.